December 24th, 1944, near Bastogne, Belgium. The snow came down in slow, stubborn sheets, each flake a little scrap of silence clinging to the broken firs. The Ardennes were a white maze that night, and somewhere inside it, two thin lines of men were trying not to think about home. American foxholes, crusted with ice, faced German slit trenches across a shallow draw where a stream had frozen into a dull ribbon of pewter. The bulge had swollen west, radios rasped with promises no one believed, and the cold cut deeper than any order. On the American side, a squad from a battered rifle company counted rations with mittened hands and dull eyes. They had been told the 101st held Bastogne, that relief was coming, that the weather would break. It was true enough to hurt. Their sergeant, a farm boy from Iowa who knew the weight of winter, ran a thumb along the edge of a tin opener and pretended the wind wasn't getting inside his bones. Somewhere behind them, an artillery piece coughed a single round and fell quiet again. The sky glowed faintly where flares had been, then dimmed back to the color of unpolished steel. Across the draw, a small German Gruppe listened to the same wind say the same hard things. Their boots were wrong for this weather, their coats filled with other men's names, their captain's orders ironed flat by a doctrine that had no room for December. The offensive had been baptized Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine, but out here it felt like a watch on nothing at all, on hunger, on frostbite, on maps that lied. They had been told no fraternization, no mercy, no light after dusk. They believed the first two and disobeyed the third, because a small flame at the bottom of a trench can be the difference between fingers and none. What cracked the night wasn't a gunshot. It was a voice, soft, tentative, like a match struck under a blanket. Stille Nacht, one bar, then two, drifting over snow. A German private, 19, maybe 20, hummed more than he sang, half apologizing to the dark. The men around him stiffened. One hissed his name. He shrugged and made his confession to the cold, holy night. On the other side, a shape moved in the nearest foxhole. The American squad had a private who kept a harmonica tucked in a sock to stop it freezing. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he answered with the same melody, different words, the English worn smooth by 1,000 church basements and kitchen tables. Silent night. The tune met in the middle and hung there, suspended like breath. Rifles stayed pointed down. Eyes floated above the rims of holes and trenches. Snow packed sound into small spaces, smothered the clank of metal, made every human noise larger than it should have been. Someone whispered a warning that died in his scarf. Someone else muttered that they'd all be shot for this. Stay with me. This is the first thread that pulled the night apart. A minute passed. Two. No one fired. The German voice grew steadier, picking up the harmony on the second verse because it was what his mother taught him. On the third, the American sergeant's low baritone joined without asking permission. It was the kind of sound that ignores borders, the kind that remembers a different year. A flare went up far west of them, a ghostly flower that didn't touch their trees, and fell out of the sky like an exhausted thought. Then a decision walked out of the American line. He went with his hands up, fingers spread, a small lantern at his feet to push light ahead of him like a shield. He wore a scarf a child could have knit, striped and ridiculous against the snow. Halfway down the slope, he stopped, knelt, and placed something on the ground, a tin of coffee, a pack of Lucky Strikes, a piece of chocolate he'd been saving for a different Christmas. He backed away 3 steps and waited. On the German side, men argued with breath, not words. It was madness. It was a trap. It was a gift. Finally, a corporal who remembered how to be older than he felt climbed out of the trench and mirrored the walk, hands high, palms empty. He reached the little altar, set down a heel of black bread wrapped in paper, 3 cigarettes, and a photograph of a girl with a ribbon in her hair. He didn't mean to leave the photograph. It just slipped out with the bread, and when he bent to take it back, he decided to let the mistake stand. They were close enough now to see that the enemy had cheeks and ears and a nose that had been broken once, close enough to notice chapped lips, close enough to remember that monsters in stories never had hands like these. Frohe Weihnachten, the German said, wary, each syllable a step across water. Merry Christmas, the American answered, equally careful. No one moved for a long breath. Then the drawer did what drawers do. It collected small things. One man from each side became two, then three, then the kind of group who could call themselves we for an hour without getting hurt by the grammar. Weapons were slung behind shoulders, eyes flicked to the tree line and back. Snow took their boot prints and braided them together until you couldn't say where one side ended. The first exchange was clumsy but honest. Coffee for bread, tobacco for tobacco, a chocolate bar that made the German boy's face do something his face had forgotten it could do. Somewhere, a man laughed like he hadn't since September. He startled himself and stopped, but the laughter left a shape the others could stand in for a while. Names came next, first names only, nicknames easier than the ones your mother used. Tom, Max, Eddie, Hans. A medic showed another medic his hands, the way carpenters do. Someone pointed at the frozen stream and mimed skating, and three men from different countries nodded at the same memory. An American pulled a crumpled photograph from his breast pocket. His sister in a dress sewn from curtains, August sun behind her. The German corporal showed the picture he hadn't meant to give away. His daughter with the ribbon, her front teeth barely grown in. They compared the serious faces children make when adults point cameras at them and agreed children look the same in any language. It wasn't a treaty. It wasn't even safe. It was a human pause in an inhuman month. They spoke about weather more than war. Weather was neutral ground. A German boy said the cold was worse than any he'd known. An American said Iowa had taught him worse and that he still hated it. Someone asked with a rueful lift of a shoulder whether the big push would keep pushing. No one answered. War waited beyond the trees, patient as gravity. A bottle appeared, passed with the same care they gave bandages. One man sang 4 lines of a carol and forgot the 5th. Another filled it in, and a scrap of harmony rose toward branches that had held snow so long they didn't remember leaves. For a few breaths, the forest sounded like a December both sides recognized. Tomorrow, the German corporal said finally, fingers tightening on the photograph he'd accidentally given, we go back. Tomorrow, the American sergeant said, because you can tell the truth at Christmas, we go back. He paused, looked at the faces now filed under a word he hadn't used for the enemy in months, men, and added, maybe slower. They traded a promise they had no authority to make. If one of us sees the other in the sights tomorrow, we'll aim an inch to the left. It wasn't a ceasefire, not even a pact. It was a wish disguised as a joke. Stay with me, because hiding isn't the only courage in this story. Near dawn, a patrol crept along the ridge. 3 shadows moved with SS discipline, the sharp kind that likes to cut. They paused when they saw the mess below, boot prints tangled like rope, cigarette butts of 2 kinds, a circle of trampled snow where men had stood too close to be enemies. One of the shadows crouched, touched the tip of a finger to the chocolate wrapper left under a branch, and lifted it to his nose. He stood, looked down into the drawer, and told the others to spread the word. By the time the sun found a way through the clouds, the report had reached a captain who did not want his men to know that other men had been men last night. Unauthorized contact with the enemy, morale contamination. He ordered an inspection, shouted things about duty that sound best shouted. The German corporal who had left a photograph under the stars said nothing that could betray anyone else, and somehow that became his crime. On the American side, the sergeant collected his men and counted heads, counted cigarettes, counted promises he couldn't say out loud. He told them to keep their eyes open and their mouths shut because some truths grew brittle in daylight. When the lieutenant asked about unusual activity, he said the usual things: minor probing along the line, nothing to report. His voice was steady enough to pass for winter. The order came to both sides around noon, spoken different ways with the same weather. Stop all lights at night, double the sentries, fire warning shots at anything that moves. On the German side, they added a line with no melody at all: fraternization is treason. On the American side, they called it unwise contact, and said they'd court-martial anyone dumb enough to think the war had softened just because a song remembered how to sound like home. The drawer went quiet again. The frozen stream kept its counsel. But a few hours can stretch farther than a month when they're made of human things. That Christmas, the front shifted an inch inside a few rib cages and never shifted back. The German boy with the ribbon-haired daughter tucked a square of chocolate into his pocket and saved it for a spring he wasn't sure existed. The American with the scarf a child had knit wrote a letter that night and didn't mention the truce, because some mercy doesn't want to be looked at directly. He wrote instead, "I saw a face that wasn't the enemy's. It looked a lot like mine." In the following days, patrols got sharper and orders louder. A squad was transferred for cause, the phrase as blank as the snow they left behind. Somewhere, a report was filed in a folder that would never make a museum: unauthorized contact with enemy personnel. Disciplinary measures recommended. Somewhere else, a chaplain preached about peace on earth and didn't know he was speaking into the space where peace had already briefly stood. When the weather finally broke and relief punched a corridor toward Bastogne, the forest shook itself and made room for machines again. Tracks erased the braided footprints. The stream remembered how to make noise. Men on both sides added a new layer to the story they told themselves so they could do the next thing. The enemy is the enemy. And yet a small, treacherous clause lodged itself between words. Except for that one night. Years later, a box in a Bavarian attic gave up a diary that had waited under old coats and older dust. The man who had written it, no famous name, no medals that had survived, had used a neat, stubborn hand, the kind learned in school when ink blotted and teachers rapped knuckles for carelessness. The entry for December 24th was shorter than the others, as if he had been afraid to give it too much weight. We sang, we traded bread. One had a scarf like a child's. Command forbids this. I do not care. They are not what I was told. I will not forget. In an American shoebox, a photograph lived with ticket stubs and a lace ribbon. On the back, in pencil, Ardennes, the Christmas with 2 kinds of cigarettes. The man who saved it never once told the full story at the VFW hall, but he looked at that picture every December and let the quiet do the talking. History remembers the bulge with numbers and arrows, divisions, miles, dates you can quiz a good student on. It should. Those things matter, but there are also nights the official reports refuse to hold, nights when a song crossed a field and came back with bread. Those are harder to file, easier to lose, and exactly the kind that keep a person from being swallowed whole by a uniform. If this moved something in you, stay with me. Stories like this don't cancel the horror. They light a match inside it so we can see the faces. And tell me, if you had been there in that white, breathless drawer, would you have risked your orders for one forbidden hour of peace? In the decades that followed, the war receded into history books and memorials. Photographs turned sepia, medals gathered dust in drawers, and the veterans, the ones who returned, built lives around the silence of what they'd seen. Yet every December, when the air carried that same dry chill and the world seemed to slow under the weight of winter, a handful of them would remember that forbidden night in the Ardennes. For some, it came back through the sound of a hymn heard on the radio. Silent night, soft and steady as it had been then. For others, it was a certain smell, tobacco mixed with pine sap and wood smoke. And for one man, the American sergeant who had stepped out first, scarf still tucked away in a drawer, it came through his daughter's voice when she asked, years later, "Did you ever stop fighting, even for a little while?" He didn't answer right away. How do you explain to a child that the hardest thing in a war isn't pulling the trigger, but remembering how not to? So he just smiled, looked out at the snow through the kitchen window, and said, "Once. Just once." And that was enough. Across the ocean, in a small town near Munich, an old man with a limp walked each morning to the edge of a forest that looked nothing like the one in Belgium, but carried the same quiet. His name was long forgotten by most, but the way he carried himself, careful, deliberate, gentle, still spoke of the medic who had refused to let hatred become habit. He never told his grandchildren about that night, but every year, on Christmas Eve, he placed a single candle on the windowsill and let it burn until morning. And somewhere in between them, in that invisible place where memories overlap, the truce lived on. Not in history books, not in official reports, but in the way a man hesitated before calling someone enemy, in the pause between an order and obedience, in the stubborn human instinct to see another person even when the world demanded blindness. War has a way of stealing the language of empathy. It teaches men to replace faces with numbers, names with ranks. But the men who stood under that frozen sky had found their way back, if only for a few hours, to a vocabulary older than hatred, the quiet grammar of mercy. Years later, historians would stumble upon fragments, a German diary page describing the night the Americans sang, a U.S. chaplain's letter mentioning a strange peace in the woods that couldn't be explained. The military censored most of it. The official stance remained. No fraternization occurred between opposing forces. But stories have a way of surviving where orders cannot. They pass in whispers, in songs, in the trembling voice of an old man who still can't believe it happened. It wasn't a miracle, not really. No angels descended, no treaties were signed. It was smaller than that, and therefore greater. It was the refusal for one sacred night to let war be the only thing that defined them. And that, perhaps, is why it frightened the men who led them. Because if compassion could exist even here, even then, what else might it undo? So they buried the reports, burned the letters, pretended the snow had never heard music. But the truth has a stubborn way of thawing through lies, like spring through permafrost. The forbidden Christmas truce remains unrecorded, unseen, but not unfelt. It survives in every moment when someone chooses understanding over obedience, kindness over fear. If you've listened this far, remember, peace doesn't need permission to exist. It just needs someone brave enough to believe in it. And now, it's your turn to answer. If that night came again, cold and dangerous, and a voice began to sing across the dark, would you sing back?